I stood there, a vision in a Vera Wang dress. The custom-designed silk felt heavy, like armor, not a gown, tailored precisely to every expectation David and his mother had forced upon me. The sheer cost, more than my mother had spent on her entire small business inventory, was a bitter pill, but today it served a purpose. 300 guests were staring at me. They were the cream of the local social and professional elite, the very people Carol Sterling had demanded we invite to validate her status. My parents, tears in their eyes, were a beacon of silent, profound pride in the front row. They sacrificed everything: their language, their comfort, their youth, running a dry cleaning business 7 days a week so I could become Dr. Malin, a surgical resident. This day was supposed to be the symbol of my success, my American dream realized in the most undeniable way, marrying into supposed wealth and stability. This entire spectacle was for them, a promise kept. David was supposed to be waiting at the altar with effortless charm. He was, but he looked nervous. Not the excited kind of nervous a groom exhibits. This was the raw, toxic anxiety of a man who knows the clock has run out. The kind of nervous you get when the police lights flash in your rearview mirror and you know the trunk holds contraband. His posture was rigid. He kept wiping his palms on the sides of his expensive, custom-tailored suit, a suit I had largely paid for. The organ music swelled, a majestic piece selected by Carol herself, signaling the start of the Our Love Story montage. This was the moment. The lights dimmed in the massive vaulted ballroom of the Grand Conservatory. The air conditioning unit hummed, the only sound apart from the rustle of silk and the soft coughs of the guests. The massive projector screen above the altar, which David had insisted on for the cinematic quality of our life, he'd lied, flickered to life. The whole room held its breath, ready for the saccharine manufactured romance. The first clip wasn't our awkward first date video. It wasn't the slow-mo shot of the proposal, which I now knew was financed by borrowed money. It was a sterile, cold, undeniable image, a bank statement magnified to 40 feet wide. HSBC, Offshore Holdings. The name at the top read, David Sterling Holdings, LLC. A total balance of negative $380,000 flashed, highlighted in bright, aggressive red, accompanied by a bold text overlay, current liable fraudulent debt. A collective, visceral gasp rippled through the front rows. People leaned forward in their seats, thinking it was a tasteless joke, a weird avant-garde artistic choice. But the numbers were too real. David's mother, Carol, a woman whose face, even on her best day, could curdle milk on a warm day, went absolutely bone white. Her meticulously sculpted blonde hair seemed to freeze. She rose halfway out of her seat, a silent, perfect O of horror on her perfectly made-up face. She looked not at the screen, but directly at David, an expression of sheer, visceral terror passing between them. Then the audio switched on. It wasn't a voiceover. It wasn't a narrator. It was a raw, muffled phone recording, edited only for clarity. A voice, brittle and demanding, cut through the shock. And where the hell is the rest of the money, David? You told me May was good for $400,000. I need this debt settled immediately before the audit. The gasp became an audible war of confusion and scandal. The voice was a woman's, not his mother, his mistress, identified by a subsequent text chain that popped up next to the bank statement. I had titled the slide, "The True Recipials of Mylan's Capital." I saw David's eyes widen. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trapdoor had opened beneath his feet. His expensive suit suddenly seemed too tight, suffocating him. He made a low, strangled noise and lunged violently for the small sound booth tucked discreetly in the corner near the venue's entry. He tried to grab the laptop, screaming a wordless protest. But a tall, broad man, the man I had introduced to Carol an hour earlier as Uncle Mike for my father's side of the family, a retired security consultant, here to handle the priceless family jewelry, stepped out of the shadows. Mike, who was actually a recently retired police deputy and the private investigator I had hired for the day, caught David's arm in a vice-like grip that instantly subdued him. David struggled, cursing under his breath, his words muffled against his teeth, futile and pathetic. Carol finally found her voice and let out a piercing, drawn-out scream. It was not a scream of grief, but of absolute, total social ruin. It echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the venue, a perfect sound of despair. But I didn't flinch. I just stood there, my custom bouquet of white roses held steady, roses that cost nearly $5,000, watching my entire perfect life, the intricate self-serving lie he'd built around me, burn down on a 40-foot screen. I knew every word that was coming next. I had personally curated the entire reel of evidence with my brother. I had waited for this exact surgical moment. This was my grand reveal, my deposition, my cold public execution of their conspiracy. My heart was beating in a slow, controlled rhythm, the rhythm of a surgeon in the middle of a complex aortic repair. The only emotion I felt was a serene, deadly clarity. But let me back up and explain exactly how Dr. Mei Lin, the high-achieving surgical resident, turned her wedding day into a federal-level sting operation. My name is Mei Lin. I'm 28 years old. I am a machine of efficiency, discipline, and relentless ambition. I am a surgical resident at one of the top hospitals in the state, on track to specialize in cardiothoracic surgery. I did not have the luxury of a safety net or generational wealth. My parents immigrated here 20 years ago with 2 suitcases and a ferocious, terrifying work ethic. They started with nothing. They ran a dry cleaning business 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. The smell of harsh chemicals, hot steam, and industrial starch is still the scent of my childhood, a constant reminder of the physical labor that funded my textbooks. Every single achievement I had, straight A's, the Stanford acceptance, the medical school honors, was a transaction. It was for them. It was a debt of honor. I was the golden child, the tangible proof that their sacrifices were worthwhile. My mother always told me, in careful, precise English, marry a good man, May, a secure man, someone who understands the value of hard work and stability. David Sterling seemed like that man. I met him at a gala for the Hospital Foundation 2 years ago. He was tall, clean-cut, and wore suits that looked effortlessly tailored in London. He was an architect, he claimed, a principal architect, at a prestigious firm with projects stretching from Miami to Dubai. He spoke eloquently about his passion for sustainable design and civic responsibility. He was charming. He was attentive. He looked good on paper. He looked perfect standing next to me, the accomplished surgeon. He provided the East Coast lineage that Carol Sterling often reminded me I lacked. His mother, Carol, was the first complication. She was old money, or at least she performed the role of old money with terrifying dedication. She spent our first dinner together talking about her ancestral home in Connecticut and making passive-aggressive comments about my residency hours. Such a shame a bright girl like you has to work such terrible, greasy hours. Doesn't leave much time for a proper social life, does it? Or maintaining appearances. She'd purr, glancing meaningfully at my watch. I am a master of emotional suppression. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that surgeons must ignore the peripheral noise. I thought, David is nothing like her. I rationalized her behavior as simply a sign of generational difference. I was wrong. The small red flags started early, like microscopic signs of inflammation in a healthy body. He always seemed to be running low on cash. His credit cards were constantly being maxed out, but he'd brush it off with practiced ease. Just temporary cash flow issues with a massive, high-profile project, babe, he'd say, flashing that devastating, confident smile. I'm a resident. I live on instant ramen, black coffee, and 18-hour shifts. But my accounts were healthy. My parents taught me to save every penny I earned, to treat debt like a biological hazard. So when David needed $5,000 for a critical material deposit on a project in Soho, I gave it to him. Then another $10,000 for emergency payroll to keep a deadline. He always paid me back, eventually, sometimes a week late, always with a detailed, earnest story about the temporary struggle of a budding entrepreneur. I saw it as supporting his ambition. It felt like a minor partnership, an investment in our shared future. I was completely fooled. Carol started pushing the wedding details almost immediately after we got engaged. She demanded a venue that cost more than my parents' entire house. She insisted on a specific florist, a high-end caterer, and an 11-piece band, all of whom were her friends and social contacts. She openly called my suggestions for a more manageable, smaller ceremony pedestrian and embarrassing. For David's reputation, she dismissed my desire to incorporate more traditional Chinese engagement rituals as quaint little cultural trinkets. The whole event rapidly devolved into the Sterling family's performance, a $250,000 announcement of their continued societal dominance, not a genuine celebration of our relationship. I started feeling less like a bride and more like a high-interest, short-term sponsorship opportunity. The biggest alarm went off 3 months before the date. David brought me the paperwork one Friday night. He told me about his huge break. He was finally launching his own independent firm, but he needed capital, serious capital. He needed a $400,000 investment to secure the first big contract, a fictitious contract for a downtown condo project. He had everything lined up, he promised. He just needed me to sign a promissory note for a line of credit, secured against my separate premarital investment accounts. He was a master of the hard sell. He promised to repay it within 18 months, plus 10% interest. He told me it was the only way the banks would take his independent firm seriously. He positioned it as the ultimate test of our trust. I hesitated. It was my future. It was my parents' retirement fund, essentially. The financial security that represented 2 decades of their relentless labor. He looked me in the eyes, grabbed my hands, and said, with the intensity of an actor winning an Oscar, "May, this is our future. Our life together starts with this leap of faith. Don't tell me you don't trust me." That was the first time I felt genuinely cold around him. The love felt like leverage. He wasn't asking. He was demanding, using my emotional commitment against my financial prudence. My loyalty to him was being weaponized. I signed the papers the next day, a cold weight settling in my stomach. I had no idea that signature wasn't starting our future. It was ending his and providing me with the evidence I needed to perform the clean, total excision of his disease from my life. The minute the money transferred out of my accounts, David changed from a convincing actor into a careless beneficiary. The charm didn't vanish entirely, but it became transactional, like a waiter who stops smiling once the tip is secured. It was like I was a valued client now, not a fiancé. He stopped listening to my work stories. He'd zone out when I talked about a complicated 5-hour surgery, only to snap back to attention when I mentioned our joint account details. He would talk endlessly, vaguely, about his major deal and his high-level meetings. None of it made sense. He was always elusive, relying on corporate jargon that was purposefully opaque. Q4 liquidity, asset leveraging, and optimizing the client base. But he couldn't explain what his new firm actually did, or where its physical office was located. I started asking questions, simple ones based on logic, the way a resident questions an attending physician about a flawed surgical technique. Where is your office exactly? I'd love to drop by. Can I see the blueprints for the new contract, the structural specs? He would immediately get aggressively defensive. May, stop micromanaging me. You handle the scupples. I handle the capital. This is serious business. He'd snap, his face tightening with genuine malice. Then he'd immediately apologize with an expensive, thoughtless gift, a new designer handbag, diamond earrings, or a weekend getaway he'd pay for with my money. The gifts weren't compensation for the financial burden. They were payment for my silence and willful blindness. Carol was circling too like a vulture sensing a carcass. She kept pushing the wedding budget higher, demanding upgrades at every stage. She insisted on a $50,000 floral installation that she described as European avant-garde. She had a total screaming meltdown when I suggested a more affordable, locally sourced band. David's reputation demands a higher caliber May. She hissed at me over a catered lunch that cost $300 per plate. Her tone was the worst, pure, poisonous classism. It wasn't about the wedding. It was about proving something to her social circle, spending my hard-earned money to buy stas she felt I didn't inherently earn as an immigrant's daughter. She was relentless, calling me every morning with a new urgent expense. The most damning change was his phone. It used to be left on the counter, face up. Now it was glued to his hand. It was always face down, always silenced. He'd take calls in the next room, whispering conspiratorially, his body language guarded. When I asked who it was, he'd give a vague non-answer. Just my business partners. Or client crisis, urgent. He started spending late nights at the site or in meetings downtown. He'd come home after midnight, smelling faintly of cheap, cloying perfume, not the expensive kind he bought me, and stale, cheap whiskey, not his usual single malt scotch. I am a surgeon. My work demands attention to minute detail. It demands observing subtle signs of distress and pathological change. David Sterling was exhibiting multiple systemic failures. He was careless. He thought I was too busy with my medical training, too consumed by my own ambition to notice the rot at the core of our relationship. He was wrong. My professional training made me the perfect investigator. One Tuesday night, 3 weeks before the ceremony, he came home after 1 a.m. He claimed he'd been in a planning meeting with a client. I was awake, studying a set of complicated CT scans for a pulmonary embolism case. I let him shower. I went to empty his briefcase for the next day, a domestic habit he never questioned. I found it then, hidden beneath his blueprints and a folder labeled Client Confidential. It was a cheap, prepaid burner phone. The kind you buy at a convenience store with cash. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of discovery. My mind, however, was ice cold. I turned it on. There was one contact saved. A. The text history was an open sewer of betrayal. It wasn't professional. It was explicit. It was recent, detailing plans for a weekend trip to Napa Valley he had told me he was taking alone to network with investors. The timestamps told the whole disgusting story. He'd been with her 3 days ago, the night he said he was with a structural engineer in Sacramento. The betrayal was a physical blow, a stunning, crushing realization. But the next text sent the real shockwave through my system, transitioning the pain from emotional to systemic. It was from A. You promise me you'll finally dump that Asian ATM once you close the deal and get the final money injection from her. His reply was chillingly cavalier. Relax. Almost there. Carol is handling the final pressure points on her family. We will get every cent and the divorce will be quick and painless for me. I felt bile rise in my throat. It wasn't just cheating. It was planned, malicious, systemic. Finance at the investment wasn't for a business. It was for this woman and for clearing his mother's debt. And his mother, the snob, was actively involved, pushing me to spend and sign while they emptied my accounts. I closed the phone. I put it back in his briefcase, exactly where I found it. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. My surgeon's mind took over. Damage control, analysis, planning the surgical intervention. My heart was dead. My rage was professional. That night, I did not sleep. I stood in the kitchen, watching the sunrise paint the city skyline, a sight I usually only saw on my walk to the operating room. I was silent. I was calculating the necessary incision. I was seeing my life's work, my parents' decades of sacrifice, being dismantled and consumed by two greedy, pathetic, and entitled people. My immediate, non-negotiable priority was retrieval and punishment. The first call I made was at 6 a.m. to my brother Eric. He's a partner at a prestigious corporate litigation firm, a man who understands how to use the law as a weapon. I spoke in precise, clinical, emotionless sentences. Eric, I need a forensic accountant who specializes in shell companies and offshore transfers. I need a private investigator with prior law enforcement experience. I need to know everything about David Sterling Holdings, LLC, and David and Carol Sterling's personal and co-signed financial liabilities. No questions. Start now. Total budget is irrelevant. Eric, knowing me and my tone, simply replied, "Done." Send me the promissory note and all communication logs immediately. Assume we are going to court on a federal fraud charge. The next week was a blur of residency, fake smiles, and secret encrypted meetings. I was operating on 2 hours of sleep and pure focused adrenaline. I performed complex surgeries with detached, perfect concentration while simultaneously planning the demise of my own engagement. David was oblivious. He was practically skipping, convinced he was pulling off the perfect scam. He thought he was home free. He was planning to marry me, finish draining the last of my accounts under the pretext of joint marital expenses, and then suddenly have his company fail due to unforeseen market conditions, leaving me legally bound to the debt. The private investigator, a former police officer named Mike, the same Mike you would soon become my Uncle Mike at the wedding, delivered the first report on a heavily encrypted hard drive. David Sterling's architecture firm was not merely a failure, it was a ghost. It was a shell corporation created 8 months ago with the sole purpose of receiving and immediately distributing my $400,000. The funds didn't go to material deposits. They went to covering a massive six-figure personal debt that Carol had co-signed for David years ago, a debt that was threatening the foreclosure of Carol's ancestral home. The rest had been funneled into A's luxury lifestyle and David's absurdly expensive sports car payment. The revelation made my blood run cold. They weren't just using me for my money. They were using my financial capacity to protect Carol's social status and ensure she didn't lose her most precious asset, her physical symbol of entitlement. She was the absolute mastermind, the driving force. Her classist comments, her obsessive demands for an extravagant wedding. It was all a calculated, expensive distraction designed to make me feel small while they were actively destroying me. The final breaking point, the point where I transitioned from investigation to surgical intervention, came from Carol herself. She called me 2 weeks before the wedding. She was frantic, her polished veneer cracking. "May, the caterer needs the final payment of $20,000, and David's accounts are inexplicably frozen right now. Just transfer the $20,000 to the vendor directly from your personal account. Now, it's an emergency." She didn't ask. She commanded, her voice high and stressed. The lie about frozen accounts told me everything. They had hit the bottom. They were running on fumes, using my money to cover the last desperate vendor payments for a wedding that was, for them, nothing more than a photo opportunity. She had the audacity to continue treating me like a service provider while she was actively destroying my life's financial stability. That was the moment my revenge plan solidified into a concrete strategy. I was not going to call off the wedding quietly. I wasn't going to send an email to the guests. I wasn't going to allow them the dignity of a private, sealed lawsuit. No, they wanted a spectacle. Carol wanted her social validation, and David wanted his big score. I decided to give them the biggest, most publicly devastating failure they could possibly imagine. I wanted to destroy their reputation in front of every single person they cared about, their peers, their clients, their lenders. I wanted the humiliation to be a life sentence of social and financial ostracization. I called Eric back. My voice was calm and dangerous. "Eric, we are not canceling the wedding. We are using it as the venue for the deposition and the service. I need that $20,000 transferred to the caterer, just like Carol asked. We must appear compliant to the very last second. But I need all the legal documentation prepared for a public serving, and I need the venue's AV guy on retainer." The show is going on, but the script has been violently rewritten. The 2 weeks leading up to the wedding were the most intensely pressurized and meticulously organized of my life, eclipsing even my final year of medical school. I was a bride possessed, an operative running a deep cover mission. I perfected the art of performance. I smiled through the bachelorette party, pretending to enjoy the champagne and the terrible jokes. I feigned excitement during the final fitting, allowing Carol to fuss over the length of the train. David was euphoric, oblivious. He was high on the impending marriage and the final cash injections I'd given them, convinced he had pulled off the perfect, victimless crime. My plan was simple in its execution, but devastating in its effect. It hinged entirely on the fact that I was a surgeon, methodical, detail-oriented, and capable of operating under extreme pressure. Step 1. The digital incision, the video package. This was handled by Eric in the Ghost. We went beyond a simple PowerPoint. It became a 15-minute, high-definition documentary. It wasn't just numbers. It was a narrative of malice. It detailed the timeline of the $400,000 transfer, showing how it left my medical savings account and was immediately sliced into 3 distinct, pre-planned tranches. We used simple, irrefutable graphics, red lines leading from May Len to Carol Sterling's mortgage and Mistress A's lifestyle fund. To underscore the cruelty, we integrated my own security camera footage of David taking the hushed phone calls, interspersed with the audio where he called me the ATM. Eric ensured the entire video was legally defensible, structured as irrefutable evidence for the pending fraud charges. The final shot was a close-up of the burner phone's text history. Step 2. Securing the venue's infrastructure. I met the venue's AV technician, Leo, 3 days before the ceremony. The venue was guarded by Sandra, the rigidly snobbish event coordinator, who was firmly in Carol's camp. I couldn't trust Sandra. I could only buy Leo. I handed him an envelope thick with cash, $20,000, tax-free, which was more than he made in 6 months. I explained the situation with the same cold, clinical tone I used to explain a grave diagnosis. Leo, I said, I am serving legal documents for felony fraud. Your role is simple. Ensure the love story file is swapped with my video file and displayed at exactly 4 p.m. You are an essential component of a legal operation. If anyone asks, you followed my last-minute instructions as the bride. Take the money, press the button, and disappear into the kitchen staff. The look in his eyes morphed from terror to a kind of shocked, mercenary loyalty. He took the money. He promised compliance. Step 3. The legal containment. This was Eric's masterwork. We knew David would try to flee or hide his remaining assets. Eric secured an immediate temporary restraining order TRO on all Sterling accounts linked to the fraud, effective the minute the documents were served. He filed a massive civil lawsuit for fraud, embezzlement, emotional distress, and conversion of assets, making sure the papers named David and Carol as co-defendants. He also drafted a full cease and desist order preventing them from contacting me or my family. The documents were notarized and assembled into 2 imposing ribbon-tied official packets. These were the weapons. Step 4. Enforcement and security. Mike, the PI, was hired as a family-friend security consultant. His primary role was to serve the documents and ensure David was contained. His secondary role was to prevent physical interference with the screen or the proceedings. David saw Mike at the rehearsal. He even shook his hand, assuming Mike was a distant, non-threatening relative. Mike had a small, discreet body camera running the entire time, legally documenting the service and the subsequent chaos, creating an immediate, undeniable chain of evidence. I even had a small, secondary monitor placed on the altar, hidden behind a floral arrangement, facing me. My fail-safe, a micro USB with the video, ready to be plugged in if Leo failed. The day before the wedding, I sat with my parents, finally telling them the brutal truth. I did not soften the language. I told them David was a thief and his mother was his accomplice. My mother wept, not from sadness but from shock and shame that she hadn't seen it. My father, however, listened intently. When I finished, he didn't criticize. He simply stood up, looked me in the eye, and said, "Protect the Lynn name. Show them the strength of the Lynn family." Their blessing was my final dose of confidence. I slept a perfect, serene 8 hours, a surgeon mentally preparing for the most important operation of her career. Today, I wasn't getting married. I was performing a public, necessary amputation of a toxic parasite. The walk down the aisle was the longest 6 minutes of my life, a slow, deliberate march to the battlefield. My father's hand was firm on my arm. He whispered one last Chinese proverb of strength. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. I was wearing $30,000 worth of armor. I made eye contact with David, and I smiled, a radiant, cold, perfect smile. His relief was palpable. He thought the money was his, and the performance was about to begin. We reached the altar. The officiant began his pleasantries. Carol sat front and center, wearing her diamond brooch and a smug, satisfied smirk. The atmosphere was pregnant with expectation. The officiant cleared his throat. And now, a brief presentation on the happy couple's beautiful history, symbolizing their shared journey and love. The lights dimmed. The fanfare music for the montage began, lasting one beat. Then, silence. A technical pause that stretched into an eternity. Leo, my AV accomplice, executed the switch with perfection. The main screen above the altar, 40 feet of pure visibility, flickered to life. The first image was the high-resolution shot of the HSBC bank statement. The negative $380,000 balance glowed on the screen, highlighted in aggressive red, accompanied by the text, "Fraudulent liability, $400,000 converted from Mylan's account." The entire ballroom froze in a collective, horrified realization. The murmur was deafening. Carol's hand shot up to her throat, her eyes immediately darting to David, not the screen. She understood money, and she understood ruin. Then the audio started. It was the raw, unedited recording of David and the mistress, crystal clear, discussing the plan. We had synchronized the audio with the text chain, magnified for the back rows. "You promise me you'll finally dump that Asian ATM once you close the deal and get the final money injection from her." The woman's voice was sharp. David's voice, cavalier and Kroll, relax. "Almost there. Carol is handling the final pressure points on her family. We will get every cent and the divorce will be quick and painless for me." David snapped. He didn't speak, he screamed. He lunged violently for the sound booth, screaming, "Turn it off. It's a hack. It's fake." Mike, my Uncle Mike, moved with the speed and precision of a former professional. He caught David's arm in a tactical wrist lock, twisting it behind his back. David cried out, a pathetic sound of defeat. Carol was fully standing, her scream high-pitched and hysterical. "This is an outrage. Security, call the police. He's attacking my son." The irony was the final, devastating punch. I stepped forward, taking the microphone from the shell-shocked officiant. I was perfectly calm, my voice clear and amplified over the chaos. "There is no outrage, Carol. There is just the truth. This day was never a wedding. It was a controlled deposition. It was a serving of documents." I paused for dramatic effect. 300 people were absolutely silent, staring. David Sterling did not invest my money in an architectural firm. He used it to pay off a $400,000 debt he owed to the state, a debt which was co-signed by his mother, Carol Sterling. Your mother is not a victim. She is a co-conspirator. They both manipulated me into signing a promissory note under false pretenses. That is felony fraud. That is embezzlement. And thanks to Mike, a retired sheriff's deputy I hired, your scheme is over. I gestured to Mike, who pulled out the two thick official envelopes. He slammed one against David's chest. "David Sterling, you have been served with a temporary restraining order and a civil lawsuit for full damages and punitive relief." He then walked to Carol, who tried to retreat, and firmly placed the second envelope on the table. "Mrs. Sterling, you have also been served as a co-defendant in the matter of Lynn versus Sterling for fraud and conspiracy." David slumped in Mike's grip, defeated. Carol just stared at the papers, her expensive makeup running down her face. I looked at my parents. My father nodded, a single, powerful motion of pride. I put the microphone down, took off my veil, and walked off the altar, leaving David and Carol in the burning spotlight. The police, whom Eric had alerted, arrived immediately and formally escorted the Sterlings out of their own disastrous wedding. The room instantly transitioned from a wedding to the most exclusive televised social scandal of the season. David and Carol were gone. escorted out the back by uniformed officers, their expensive clothes now symbols of their utter defeat. Guests were buzzing, their faces a mix of shock, pity, and exhilarated gossip. Carol's society friends were frantically gathering their purses, desperate to distance themselves. David's business associates were already texting their own lawyers. I didn't watch them leave. I walked straight to my parents. My father embraced me, a rare, powerful moment. "You protected us, May. You protected the Lynn name." That was my only victory measure. My brother Eric was already working the room, fielding questions from key guests, many of whom were connected to the Sterling's lenders. The reputation of David and Carol Sterling was not just damaged, it was incinerated. They were instantly toxic. The precision of the forensic video meant no one could defend them. The word fraudster was now their permanent social label. The venue was prepaid, the food was ordered, the band was ready. I walked back up to the microphone, no longer a bride, but Dr. Lynn, the surgical resident, the architect of my own life. "Thank you all for coming," I announced, my voice clear. "The ceremony is officially canceled. However, the food is paid for. The music is here. Please stay and celebrate my career. 2 hours ago, I successfully completed the most difficult surgical procedure of my life. I raised my empty glass, a successful, clean excision of a toxic, malignant relationship. Cheers." The response was tentative. Then a loud, roaring cheer went up. The expensive, hijacked wedding turned into an impromptu party, a celebration of my freedom and my surgical residency's completion. It was the best, most cathartic party I've ever thrown. Eric was able to secure a lightning-fast, comprehensive settlement. David and Carol had zero leverage. The public humiliation meant they could not afford a lengthy public court case that would further expose their finances. They settled immediately, giving me back every penny of my $400,000, plus damages and full coverage of my legal fees. I took the original $400,000 and moved it into a diversified, ironclad trust fund, protected against any future manipulation. I filed the paperwork to legally change my name back to Lynn immediately. The final, sweet act of revenge was the honeymoon. It was a 2-week, all-expenses-paid trip to Bali. First class, private villa, fully non-refundable. I went alone. I spent 2 weeks reading novels, drinking cheap beer, and not answering my work phone. I finally rested. I finally felt free and completely unburdened. I came back a new person. I am still a surgeon, meticulous and demanding, but I am more cautious, more meticulous in my personal due diligence, and infinitely more ruthless when betrayed. David Sterling is a non-person now. The last I heard through Eric's contacts, he's working as a low-level assistant in a construction company in a completely different state, unable to secure any professional architecture license. Carol was forced to sell her ancestral home to cover her remaining debts and legal fees. They got exactly what they deserved: social ruin and financial destitution. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate the woman whose professional life is spent cutting out human hearts and excising disease. I know how to handle a clean, total excision, and I am very, very good at clean excisions.